All right, guys, welcome to our next lecture in Principle of Macroeconomics. In this, we're going to cover markets, supply, and demand. So, just a recollection of where we're at so far in this course is we've got foundations, measurement, models, and applications. Here, we're laying down the foundations of economics. And I want to kind of expand on something I mentioned last time, which is what differentiates macroeconomics from microeconomics. So both of them really start at the market situation. Microeconomics takes us to the household behavior, and in macroeconomics, we go up to the economy. We aggregate up. So in microeconomics, we're interested in what's driving these decisions for the households and the firms, and how does that translate into market behavior. In macroeconomics, we're really looking at and starting with the markets, just as we're going to do today, and we work our way to the economy. Okay, so what is a market? A market is simply the buyers and sellers and the institution or arrangement that brings them together. So if you got selling, you got buying, whatever it is that brings them together, that's what we're going to call a market. Let's think of some examples here to kind of highlight this for us. What's an example of a small market? Well, like a little farmer's market. Might call that like or a similar example would be like a flea market, right? Just a small group of people in a small local area coming together, buying and selling. What's the institution here, right? This might be the place that they're gathering and the cultural and social factors that allow them to sort of come together to find each other, to know what's happening. What are some large markets? Well, there's several ways to think about this. One might be the housing market. So when you think of the housing market, why is that a big market? There's lots of buyers, there's lots of sellers, there's lots of activity going on. That gives us a housing market. What's interesting about a housing market, right, is that can be a local thing that we're thinking about. It could be a regional thing that we're thinking about. It could even be a national thing. I guess we don't really think about it as international, but you can have international markets too, not so much in housing. Now, housing is interesting, right, because these are large markets, but your houses don't move across geographic boundaries, right? Another way to think about this would be like Amazon or eBay or something like this, right? These are large markets, people connecting all over the world. And this is just, right, we can think a market for cars, we can think places that people come together, we can think of institutions like Walmart or Target that have lots of buyers coming to them as sellers of particular products, and those are competing, right? Markets are anywhere buyers and sellers comes together, and whatever institution or arrangement brings them together. Okay, so how do markets work? Well, one of the things we want to be thinking about when we go to buy something is, what is it that you want to know when you're considering buying something? What's the very first thing? So I'm going to leave a brief pause here. Fill in your own mind. What am I about to write down? What do you want to know when you're going to buy something? Yeah, the first thing, obviously, is the price of something. Now, there's lots of other things that we might be thinking, right? But price is definitely the first thing. What's the next? What are the follow-up things that you're thinking about? Maybe it's the quality. Might be the condition, new, used, etc. And there's lots of other things, right? The list of things can go on, all sorts of options, but these are probably the first couple of things that really come to our mind. And this highlights some important things. Prices are the core of any economics class for a reason, and that's because prices do things that there's nothing else can do. And prices do two principal things. First, they give information on how buyers value the good or the service. Okay, prices convey information. How do you know this, right? Well, try to put yourself in the shoes of a seller. You look at something and you say, wow, the price of this is really high. What does that mean? Well, one of the things it means is that buyers probably value it very, very highly. What's the other thing that it does is it conveys information the other direction. How costly is it to produce? So as a consumer, you go to the market, you see the prices. What are you learning? Well, you're saying other people want a lot of this, combined with how costly is this to produce. Another way to say this, because we've already met this very important idea, is what are the values of the alternative uses of those inputs, right? So if I'm going to a market and I'm like looking at a laptop computer, I want to replace my laptop, and I go and I see the prices. What am I learning by seeing that, man, the prices of laptops higher than I expected them to be, perhaps? Well, I'm learning that people really value laptops. Those are useful things. They get a lot of entertainment, a lot of productivity, a lot of value out of right? A lot of value out of having a laptop, having a good, high-performing laptop. It also might tell me how costly it is to produce, and this is what's important about prices, is that they move around, right? So if I go and I show up and the prices aren't too high, well, maybe that means people really highly value them, but they're just not very costly to produce right now. We've got good production processes, and the inputs, the resources are not spread too thinly. But as we know right now, the time that I'm recording this lecture, is microchips are being underproduced. They're very costly and difficult to produce. They're really holding up the supply chains, right? It's actually very costly to produce things that take microchips right now. And so if I go and I see the prices are very high, what do I learn? Well, people value laptops a lot, and it's very difficult and costly to produce. Some things are pretty easy to produce, right? And as a consequence, the prices are pretty low. What's another market? Maybe your local lemonade stand during the summer, and the neighborhood kids are out selling lemonade. Well, that's a pretty low cost thing to produce. There's not a lot of high value alternative to lots of the things that are involved in that production process. And to be quite frank, it's just not a thing that we're going to value very highly. So you don't see kids out there charging $10 cups of lemonade. Well, maybe you do, but probably they're not doing well in that particular market. These values of the alternative uses of the inputs are opportunity costs. So if we have things like microchips that have extremely high value alternative uses, right, then my personal laptop might be pretty low on the list of the way that these are valued. Then that's going to raise the cost very, very high. Okay. Now, these combine to give us one of the most important lessons in economics, and that is that prices are emergent. One of the things that non-economists or people that haven't taken economics classes and thought about them very carefully don't understand is that prices are not set by producers in the sense that we think they are set by producers, right? So I'm selling something, I can just list whatever price that I want, right? So I have a house, it's in, an average area of town, and I got a purple door on my house, and I say to myself, man, I can set whatever price I want to sell this house, and I've got some unique feature. I've got a purple door on my house, and I just know there's a couple out there looking for their first home that are just dying to have a purple door. Am I going to be able to sell, let's say my house is worth $200,000. Am I going to be able to sell that for $500,000? People come up to see the house, and I, tell my realtor, I'm like, listen, really highlight that purple door, because that's what's going to get me $500,000 for my house. You immediately know I'm not going to be able to sell that, right? I have a laptop. Yeah, there's a microchip shortage, and I start selling my laptops at $5,000 a piece, right? Well, there are other people out there selling laptops for $1,000, even if I have the best laptop. What are the odds I'm selling them for $5,000 a piece? Why is that true? That's true because prices are emergent. What do we mean by emergent? We've met this idea once already in class, but I'm going to reiterate because it's that important. Something is emergent when it is of human action, but not specifically of human design. So how do prices get set? Well, people that are selling things want to set the price as high as they can, but still be able to sell what it is that they're trying to sell. People that are trying to buy something, but at the lowest price that they can get it. These two things come together. They're both actions, but nobody then gets to orchestrate how the prices work out, and yet they do, because these forces come together to end up giving us something. That's emergent behavior. That's emergent order. And so back to my house example, then I set the price at $500,000, and true enough, there's a couple out there, maybe more than one couple out there. They love the house. They think the purple door is really a special selling point. What are they going to do, though? Right? Because my neighbor is also selling a house. It's in the same neighborhood. It's a similar house. It has, various things similar or different between it. More square footage but fewer bedrooms, whatever's going on, and no purple door. And they're selling their house at, $210,000. Am I really going to be able to sell my house for $500,000? It's a trade-off, right? And that couple that's saying, man, we really value the purple door, they're not going to value it at $300,000 or $290,000 over my neighbor's house, which is similar and competitive in a similar neighborhood, right? Obviously not. And that's going to tell us intuitively that there are forces that are going to set the prices such that I can't just go and set whatever price it is that I would like to set. What's constraining me? Other people selling similar or the same products. People's individual, as a consumer, their individual things that are driving them, how much they value something is fundamentally what they're doing, and that's built on a wide variety of things. So it's very, very important when we see prices that we don't think of them as arbitrary. We don't think of them as being just set and we're all just victims out here. There's forces that we can't see. This is one of the critical lessons in economics, right? Is the seen and the unseen. What can we not see that's happening? That's what's going on in markets, and that's what I'm going to show you in this particular lecture. So let's take a look at how do we see the value, the value that consumers are putting on a particular product. And in economics, we call that demand, right? So what's demand? Demand is the willingness and the ability to purchase something. So I have to want it, but I also have to be, reasonably able to purchase it. I would love to have a high-end sports car. I'd love to have a Ferrari or a Lamborghini, right? Do I really demand one in the sense that a market recognizes my demand? Of course not. I don't have the ability to purchase such a thing. I can't afford it, right? And do I factor into the demand for, hamburgers produced at restaurants that are local to me? Absolutely, right? I love hamburgers, love cheeseburgers. I don't know who eats burgers without cheese on them, so I should just say cheeseburgers. For the market for cheeseburgers around here, do I have a willingness? Absolutely. Love to go out, take my family, enjoy a good burger. Do I have the ability to purchase that thing? Absolutely, right? I can afford a night out on the town with my kids, enjoy a burger, feed my family, have a good time. I'm factoring in the sense that I am demanding. Does that mean I am always buying? Well, no, because sometimes I'm going to look at their prices and say, tonight, can't really afford that. Don't really want a burger that bad. Other times, I'm in, right? So let's think then about how that price that we're so interested in tells me something as a consumer. And you just fundamentally know this, right? Maybe this is your first economics class. You already know this. If the price of something goes up, do you end up purchasing more or less of it? Are you more or less likely to purchase it? Do you purchase more or less of it? Do you buy it more or less frequently, right? It's just obvious, right? Price of something goes up, you buy less of it. Why? Because we're being communicated the market situation by this price. Now, there are a couple notable exceptions, but I really want to highlight these are exceptions. These are rare, right? Some things, the price of them goes up. It doesn't cause people to buy less of them necessarily. Good example, this might be a luxury item, right? So things where paying a higher price is sort of part of why you do it, right? You want to buy you're a high status individual. You want to buy your fiance. You're going to propose your hopefully future fiance an engagement ring. The price of that engagement ring going up really just allows you to signal how much you love her and how high status you are, right? The other thing is called Giffen goods. This is sort of an odd little example, so I'll be brief about it. Some things, like when you're at the opposite end, you're at a very tight budget constraint. When the price of that thing goes up, you might buy more of it because it crowds other things out of your budget. Okay, so what would be, well, let me talk about sort of the classic example. There's a study where they've got mice in a cage and they're feeding them, and there are two options. The mice have two options for drinks, right? One is like soda water, it doesn't taste especially good, but it keeps the mice alive, right? And then the other, they've got like a soda in there. And the mice have a certain number of, they press the button to release the drink into their little bowls, right? And they have a certain number of pumps, a certain number of pushes of the button per day, right? And that releases a certain amount out. And that teaches the mice, right, there's a budget constraint, like how much water comes out. And they have to, the mice sort of begin to figure out how this is going to work, right? How much soda can they afford? They'd drink all soda if they could, but if the number or the amount of soda that comes out per pump, and they have a limited number of pumps, they can't necessarily survive on that, so they got to mix how much they drink, right? Now, if the price of the water that doesn't taste very good goes up, but it's still very low relative to the price of the soda, the stuff that tastes good, you can actually see, because the mice need a certain amount to live, that if the price of the lower quality item goes up, but they need it to live, they might actually buy more of it. Would be an example of this sort of in the real world, right? You got ramen, you got steak. These are the two things you're surviving on as a college student. The classic example in college, right? And so you eat a certain amount. 6 days a week you eat ramen, and then you've saved up your money. You can afford that steak once a week on the weekend, right? Then the price of these two things is very different, right? It's $1 per ramen. It's whatever. Just pick an arbitrary number, $10 a pound for the steak, right? If the price of the ramen goes up, will you buy more steak? Well, normally that's what we would see would happen. But in this case, because you're up against that budget constraint, you can actually see a very particular situation in which you might actually buy ramen a little more frequently. Now it's $1.50 a pack, so you can't afford a steak once a week. You can only afford a steak every other week. So actually, your demand for the thing is actually higher, right? Okay, so again, these are exceptions. Most of the time, gas prices go up, you can buy less gas. Milk prices go up, you can buy less milk. Movie ticket prices go up, less movie tickets. On and on and on. Almost everything fits this. This is actually why economists call this the law of demand, and not merely a theory or anything like that. Okay, so what does this look like? Well, what this looks like is we get what's called downward sloping demand. Well, how do we know that that's downward sloping? Let me show you. Suppose there's a price, and that's associated with a quantity. This is what we call a price quantity pair. We're saying at this price, you want this much, right? If the price goes down, right, we will see the quantity demanded, how much people want to buy, go up, right? And if we were at price 2 and we went up to price 1, we would see the amount that people want go down. Okay, very straightforward. Price goes down, the amount that we want to consume as consumers ends up going up. Very straightforward. Okay, what I'm highlighting here is that price is fundamentally the relationship, demand. I don't know why I wrote price. Demand is fundamentally the relationship between price and quantity for consumers. Okay. And the reason I want to highlight this is because one of the things that sometimes confuses us when we first interact with economics is we say, okay, here's the price for some good, and here's the quantity that's associated with that, right? And the price goes up, and then we say demand goes up, right? Well, that's not actually accurate, right? The price of something going down makes the quantity that we want go up, but demand stayed the same. Okay, what does it look like when demand goes up? Well, that's actually a shift of the curve. Okay, so in this case, when we see price move around, we're actually going to see movements along the curve, not movements of the curve itself. Okay, and I want to highlight that because that's just always one of those things that we get a little bit confused about first time we interact with this material. And guaranteed question on both the quiz and the exam, so make special note of yourself, to yourself. of this particular idea. Okay, so what does move the curve, right? So there's movement along the curve. That's the price of the item itself, right? If we're talking about the market for laptops, the price of laptops moves. That's going to move us along the demand curve, because the demand curve is the relationship between price and quantity for consumers. But what that relationship is determined by a good number of things. And really this list is, I don't want to say infinite because that's not exactly right. It's very, very, very long. All right, and so I'm just going to present a few broad categories that capture a lot of the ideas. This is going to be the things that I use in this class that are going to be very useful. But of course, there's any number of things that would be sort of specific to particular goods, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and so this is what I'm going to call the location of the demand curve. That's like mathematical, right? Because the ideas that are at play here is how do we sort of mathematize what it is that we're showing. It's beyond the scope of this class, so I'm not going to worry about it too much. Okay, but let's take a look at the first one. The first determinant is simply what we call taste or preference. How much do you like something determines what price-quantity relationship you're going to be willing to that you're going to have, right? So at what price, how much are you willing to buy? So let's take a couple of examples really quickly, right? I love tacos. So that's going to factor into what relationship between price and quantity that I'm going to have, right? So at some price, I'm going to consume a certain amount of tacos. You, on the other hand, you're an odd person apparently. You don't like tacos. At the same price, right? So $1 per taco, whatever. I eat 10 tacos. And you just really don't like tacos. So maybe, that's a pretty low price. You don't hate them, so you'll eat one. Well, now we have a different curve. In fact, we can draw that. This might be actually instructive, right? Price and quantity, and here's me. I'm the pink demand curve, right? And so at a price of, in fact, we can just write it down as $1 per taco, right? I come along, 10 tacos for me. And you are the white demand curve here, right? Your demand's way back here. Why is that? Let me highlight this. Demand for Dr. Stitzel, right? And demand for you, the viewer. At the price of 1, you only want 1, right? So what determined why my demand has this location and your demand has this location? Well, we're saying it's the taste or the preference we have for tacos. I'm a taco lover. Man, at this price, I'll just go crazy on tacos. Now, we could actually have people that have really odd demand curves. And actually, this would be true for any number of things. We just don't think about this very often. So what if you don't want any tacos at any price, right? You want 0 tacos regardless of any level of price. Don't care what level of price it is. 0 tacos. There's just people out there that is just not their favorite food, right? I have foods that I don't like, and at particular prices don't affect me, right? Could be free. I'm not eating eggplants, not eating artichokes. Just don't like that, right? There are other people out there that love those as foods, and they'll have what we call kind of normal, just because that's how we think about it, but normal demand curves for it, right? Taste preference is really a big determinant in the location of the demand curve, okay? So, but when we're thinking about these things, what we're really thinking about is how these things move around. So both their location and what would actually cause them to move if there were a change. So for example, if the taste and preference for something for an individual or for on average for all the consumers in the market, if that were to increase, what happens to demand? Well, demand would go up, okay? So we have this demand curve down here, and we say, look, here's some price, here's some quantity. I mean, we can use the same example, right? This is me eating tacos, right? For whatever reason, just discover that I love tacos more than ever. My taste for them goes up, right? Now, taste doesn't only have to apply to foods, to like the biology of tasting things, but that's a word for our taste or preference for something, right? Well, what does that fundamentally mean for demand to go up? What that means is at the same price, I'm willing to consume more. at the same price, right? So Q1 is less than Q2 because my demand went up. So if there's taste preference increase, we see this shift outward. So before, remember, I was saying movement along the curve. Now we've got this idea of a shift here for us. And that is, how do we move curves, or what determines where those curves are in space? It's going to be these determinants, the first of which is taste and preference. In economics, we say, we don't question people's taste or preferences. That means those things are taken as given. Why is it I like tacos and you don't like tacos, and our friend over here that won't eat tacos at any price? You can give him tacos for free, he won't eat them, right? That's their taste or preference. Okay, lots of other things determine the location of our demand curve. Let's take a look at some of those things. One obvious thing that you've probably been thinking of since I started this section is your income, right? It doesn't matter how much I like something if I can or can't afford it. Now, what's interesting about income is we actually see income has two different potential relationships with any type of any particular good or service, right? And we call these normal. Normal goods would be things that if your income goes up, and we're going to denote income as Y, that's actually going to be something really common all throughout this class. So I'm going to say income is Y. So remember that. Make a special note to yourself because this isn't going away. Income is denoted as Y. And the reason for that is, well, there's lots of things that are going to use the letter I in macroeconomics, and investment is really going to be the one. But also you have things like interest rates, and so we just use Y in this case as income. Okay, so income goes up, I consume more of it. That's probably an example that you would be confident thinking about most of the time. What are some good examples of that? Well, there's lots of interesting ones, right? And something like, I don't know, steak. If my income goes up, I'm gonna have more steak, right? If my income goes up, I might go to more movies. Now, all of these things could not be true for any particular individual, right? You might not like steak. My wife was somebody that didn't care for steak for a long time because she grew up, her parents liked their steak well done, and she never understood the appeal of steak until we got married, and then we went out and had a normal medium rare steak, and all of a sudden it's like, wait, this is a much better experience, right? So her taste and preference changed, so her demand for steaks is different now than it was before. When we were poor and we were in grad school, we didn't eat much steak, then we got a job, we made more money, our income went up, the amount of steak that we chose to eat went up, right? Now for you, maybe you just don't like steak, and so this is not a good example of it, but I'm just kind of giving some broad categories. Anything that if your income goes up that you would buy more of it is a thing that would be a normal good and would have this relationship. Now, some things are inferior goods. If your income goes up, you buy less of it. Sort of the opposite of that Giffen good idea, right? Remember, Giffen goods are related to price. But if you're eating particular foods because you can afford them, right? I don't know, you're eating ramen and saltine crackers. Well, if your income goes up, you can eat more steak. This is a classic inferior good. I drive a Nissan Sentra, and I think Nissan Sentras are probably a great example of inferior goods. If your income goes up and you need to replace your car, if yours broke down, your income goes up, or you're more or less likely to buy a Nissan Sentra. For those of you who don't know, right, this little four-door sedan thing, like small and not particularly high quality, right? Well, obviously not, right? Because if you are in a situation where you're driving a Nissan Sentra, your demand was like this, and now your income goes up, and you're more likely to buy a nicer car, right? Your demand for Sentra will actually go down. Demand for Sentra will actually go down. That means at the same price, it's kind of interesting, right? Because you can think of demand curves as sort of like the quantity you would buy, but also like the likelihood that you would buy it, right? Because some of these things are just like, we don't think of buying multiple cars in very many time frames, right? But think about it as like, maybe if this is for my whole lifetime, right? This is for my whole lifetime. And so if my income hadn't gone up, then I might have bought 2 Sentras, but my income went up, So I bought one Sentra, so my demand is now actually down to just one Sentra for my lifetime. Hopefully I never have to drive a Sentra again, right? Okay, a key point here, right, is that what determines whether a good is normal or inferior is how you value it. And that value is entirely subjective. It's entirely subjective. What value something holds to you is something that depends on how it is that you value it. That's what I mean by subjective. Okay, now some of you are saying, wait a minute, there's an objective value to water, air, calories that you would take in your diet. Not disagreeing with any of those things, right? Lots and lots of things. Basically, every example I've given is a, sort of fundamental human need, right? Clothes, housing, transportation, right? Things that just, you can't really be human if you just have zero of any of those things, right? But I'm talking about the relationship between particular examples of those things. And even, right, we even know people that just have even like biologically driven different needs, right? You have friends that need more sleep or need less sleep than you, or eat more or eat less, seem to operate better on any number of these things. People that like being out in the countryside in the weather, and people that like being in the comfort of home, right? Those things are all still, that's what I mean by subjective. Not that there aren't objective needs and constraints on all of these things, but that when we're talking about on the margin, remember that idea, on the margin, these things are determined by who it is that's buying them. Okay, next example is what we call prices of substitutes, right? So remember, goods, services, I'm going to abbreviate that as G and S sometimes. A substitute is something that we consume instead of something else. The classic example is like Pepsi and Coke, right? So if I go to a restaurant, I sit down, I say, I'll have a Coke, and they say, well, we only have Pepsi products. I say, fine, no problem, right? Love Pepsi products. That's because, again, value is subjective. Some of you hopefully are sitting there listening going, no, it's Coke or nothing. Pepsi's like not even close to Coke. Well, that's based on your taste or preference, right? Some people are out there saying, yeah, Pepsi's better, right? And then some people are like me. I'm extremely indifferent between the two things. If they're exactly the same price, I have the exact same availability to me, right? Then it's going to completely depend on what it is that I'm doing. I enjoy the occasional cigar. When I'm doing that, I love to sip on a Coke. It's a much better experience than Pepsi, except when you get a cigar that's particularly oily. And in that case, the Pepsi, a little bit sweeter. It's a little bit better with the Coke. You get something that's more spicy, has more pepper notes in it. You want Coke. Those things work together. More on this idea in a minute. But now, of course, if we're drinking something with dinner while we're out on the town, right, is the only substitute here Pepsi and Coke? Of course not, right? Dr. Pepper is another substitute. Some people would put Dr. Pepper ahead of both of these things. One of my good friends is like that, just an absolute Dr. Pepper addict, right? Mountain Dew. What about alcohol, right? I composed this list in class one time, and I got such a laugh out of what people were suggesting that I actually copied it over here. Somebody said, yeah, Pepsi and Coke, like maybe drinking some alcohol like Crown is different. Now, some of you, of course, are in your head thinking, what, right? Like Crown and Coke is a thing. More on that in a moment. Hold that idea because you got it, right? What about some like weird examples? Have any of you ever had RC Cola? Right. I have a brother who just, at the time of this recording, graduated high school, and we were out. We were picking up some groceries for the weekend. We were all together. It's kind of family outing, right? And we saw RC Cola, right? Some of us that have seen it before, had it for a little older, were like, oh, we should try that. He said, what? What's wrong with you people? Don't want to try that, right? We're like, no, okay, come on, let's try it, right? And he wouldn't drink it. He's a Pepsi Coke purist, I guess, right? Would not try the RC Cola. So for him, those aren't substitutes. For me, I kind of like RC Cola every now and then, right? You can judge me. What about water, Gatorade, tea, coffee? What's the theme here? Anything you can drink is a potential substitute. Now, what's the closeness of the substitute? Well, that depends on your taste and preference, right? But Pepsi and Coke is the classic because these two things are very similar, right? Whereas like Pepsi and lemonade, my other brother, lemonade's like one of his favorite drinks. So these might be really great substitutes, right? He sits down, he and I are at the taco shop, right? He orders a Pepsi. Oh, they're out. He takes the lemonade, he's just as happy, right? I get the lemonade, I'm kind of like, I was really looking forward to my Pepsi with my tacos, right? And then other people like tea, coffee, be classic examples. Those are probably good substitutes for each other, not as good substitutes for Pepsi. Now, so what's the fundamental relationship? If the price of a substitute goes up, so I'm sitting there, I'm in the store, do I want Pepsi, do I want Coke? And I look and I see, wow, the price of Coke has gone up a lot. Let's say it's just like crazy, right? It was $6 for a 12 pack, and now it's $60 for a 12 pack. Some ridiculous price change. Well, what am I going to do? My demand for Pepsi is going to go up because Coke is a substitute for Pepsi. My demand for Pepsi will go up. Okay, so that's probably the tricky part when we're thinking about this particular area, is just keeping what is the fundamental relationship at play here. How do we make sure we're talking about the demand for the good and not the demand for the substitute, right? Okay, so price of a substitute goes up. If my alternative options get more expensive, I'm more likely to consume the products that I'm actually considering buying. Okay. Now, one thing I want to kind of remind us of here is all determinants are symmetric, right? This is a really big idea here. All determinants are symmetric. So if I say the price of a substitute goes up, demand for that good goes up, right? So price of Coke goes up, demand for Pepsi goes up. It also means if the price of Coke goes down, demand for Pepsi goes down. This is what I mean by symmetric. All determinants are like that. So there's not a situation where the price of a substitute goes up and then demand goes down. And that's kind of the classic pitfall, is being confused about price of Coke versus demand for Pepsi. So keep that in your mind. All right. Next one is price of complements. Price of complements. We've already mentioned two, right? So let's just write those down. When I'm smoking a cigar, I like to have a Pepsi or a Coke, either one. Those are things that I consume together, and that makes them complements. Notice that compliments with E here, not compliment with I, as in saying nice things about people. These are compliments, things that go together. What's the other thing that we mentioned a minute ago? Oh, Crown and Cola, right? I'm sure none of you listening to this ever drink Crown and Coke or Jack and Coke or anything like that, right? Things that we consume together. What are some other like classic ones? Peanut butter and jelly, right? We can think of probably 100 examples, but let's just throw a couple others out there that are sort of highlight a couple of ideas. How about cars and gasoline, right? If you have a car, you end up needing to have gasoline. So some things are like very strong complements, right? I know all sorts of people that have a cigar, don't drink a Pepsi. And of course, there's all a number of times that we drink Pepsis and we don't have a cigar with them, right? Any number of people that this isn't a combination that they like. We all know people that peanut butter and jelly. But how many people do you know have a car and don't put gas in it, right? So there's all kind of different relationships that are happening here. Anything that you can think of that's like words that just go together, socks and shoes, right? These are complements. Now, what happens? Let's take an example, right? I go over to the cigar shop, and just every time that I have a cigar, I'm gonna drink a Pepsi with it, right? And I go there, and the price of Pepsis at the cigar shop just through the roof. They're like, oh man, Pepsi shortage. I'm charging $12 for a can of Pepsi to go with your $12 cigar, right? As opposed to they used to charge $1, right? What am I gonna do? Maybe, I can afford it. I just really, really want the cigar that day, and I just bite the bullet. But there's a high probability that I turn around and leave. So what happened? The price of a compliment went up. The demand for the good went down. So what does that look like? Right. Let's just do cigars. Right. I got some demand for cigars, but the price of Pepsi, which is the thing I always consume with it, goes up. My demand for cigars will fall. So 1, 2, right? That means at the same price for the cigar, remember it's the price of the Pepsi that went up, I was consuming whatever, certain number of cigars per month. Now I'm going to do that at a much lower rate. Notice the bigger the change in the price of the complement, the bigger the change is going to be in demand. So demand falls. That's what demand falls looks like. Demand falls, it moves to the left. Okay, let me go through a couple others really quickly. Frankly, these are just, you've got the idea now, so you kind of got the pattern. Number of buyers, right? So one of the things is if there's a market, then the demand will depend on how many people are in that market. If there's more buyers, there's higher demand, right? So it's not just individual demand. When we think about demand as a market phenomenon. Expectations of future prices. I'm going to use this example a little bit later on too, so we'll be able to drive it home. But here's an idea, right? If we expect the price of something to go down in the future, how much do we buy of it today? The answer is less, because I'm going to wait for the price to fall, right? So it's the start of the fall semester. Gas prices are kind of high because of summer travel, and we know that travel is going to be less, so gas prices are going to come down. So if your gas tank is, at half or a quarter, you're going to go buy gas today. No, not if you can hold off, let the price fall. So your demand today goes down. If you expect prices to be higher in the future, right, then you will buy more today so that you don't have to buy as much in the future. Okay, another one is expected future income. So if I think I'm going to make more in the future, hopefully you're close to graduating, got a great job lined up, right? So you think the amount of money that I'm going to be making, remember income is Y, the amount of money that I'm going to be making in the future is higher, then you might spend more now. Your demand for any particular normal good is going to be higher now. And this is an idea that related to an idea we call consumption smoothing, okay? So you come to office hours, I give you 2 candy bars, 2 full-size Snickers. That's one of my favorite candies, right? Are you going to sit there and just eat up both of those candy bars right now? Probably not, right? You might eat one now and then save one for after lunch. Or you might eat one now and you might eat one tomorrow. And the reason for that is we typically like to have consumption that's sort of smooth over time. So you could, based on your income, you could consume like this, right? So here's our level of consumption. Here's our time. Let's say it's like our lifetime, right? Our lifetime, the amount of consumption that we've got. C is going to be for consumption the whole semester. It could look like this, right? It could look like this. What's happening here, right? You have this lower level of income earlier on in your life, and then, right, you get the big promotion, and then you make higher income. Okay, I'm making a really simple example here because we're talking about, we want to keep it simple, but obviously this would move around a lot, right? You might have a certain level of income, and then you move out, and then your income goes down, and then it goes up when you graduate, and it goes up when you get promoted, it goes up when you switch jobs, it goes down when you get fired, right? It's going to move around a lot. But the point is this how you're going to consume if your income looks like this? Like, let's say your adult life, right? You're out on your own, you're in college, you're making your own money, you're at a certain level of consumption, you graduate, you get a great job, you get a higher level of consumption. Probably not, right? Probably actually it'll look something like this, right? Where I might borrow a little bit more when I'm in college in order to not have to live quite as poor, and as a result, right, I'm going to end up paying some of that off in school loans and debt, and so the amount of consumption I do relative to my income will be somewhat lower. This is what we call smoothing, right? You're just kind of leveling out your consumption instead of letting it be these really big, stark shifts. And economists have lots of good evidence that this is a real effect that happens with actual people in their lives. Okay, so remember what we're doing. We're looking at what are prices doing, how do markets allow prices to emerge, and then we looked at demand. So we're saying what's the value that consumers are placing on a particular good, and how does that set their demand curve, right? For the exact same reasons, suppliers are going to have the same kind of process happening, except what's happening in this situation is what is determining the amount that suppliers are willing to make available is the values of the alternative uses of the inputs. Okay, so the supplier is a straightforward, intuitive thing, right? Supplier is gonna make more available to sell if prices are higher, right? I mean, you can think about this as an example, just straightforward in your own life, right? you have a Nissan Sentra like me, you poor fool, right? And you'd be willing to sell it, but you kind of need it, right? You kind of need it. And so now that's a bimodal question, but like, just bear with me. There's some relationship between price and quantity, right? In fact, let's just do that to where it makes total sense to us. Okay, so your supply curve looks like this, and we'll say, again, right? I'm drawing price and quantity, but we can think of supply and demand, the relationship between price and quantity, several ways, right? Your likelihood of selling something, the amount that you would want it, the frequency with you would buy, like all those things work here, right? So at some price, actually, let's make this even smarter. There's some price now out there, right? It's not zero, but you're not willing to sell your car, okay? If the price goes up, the likelihood that you are willing to sell your car goes up. Some non-zero quantity likelihood, right? If you're a person who sells cars, the price goes up, you'll sell more of them, right? If you are, you go up into the Colorado mountains and you cut down wood and then you bring it down to Texas and you sell it. What's the frequency with which you will do that if the price is higher? More, right? What's the likelihood you would forego your normal tree cutting trip in order to go on the family vacation if the price of lumber is higher? It's lower, right? So we see that relationship between between price and quantity when we're talking about suppliers or producers, right? So we're more likely to sell something if prices rise. We'll sell more of it if prices rise. We will more frequently sell things such that the quantity of things totally sold goes up if prices rise. Okay, so this should be straightforward, intuitive that we're grabbing here. Again, this idea is that this is the relationship between price and quantity. Okay, so some of you probably even had this thought, and maybe some of you even did this, right? There's in recent car markets, right? Used car prices have gone up very high because of what's happened in new car markets, right? Those are substitutes, new cars and used cars, right? And so the price of things changed dramatically, and so people were more likely to be willing to sell a used car that they had because the price of them was higher, right? The price of them was higher. Okay, so in the same way that what determines the relationship between price and quantity for consumers is called the location, we also have that for supply. What determines what's the relationship between price and quantity? The main one, right? The one that we really want to be thinking about is cost of inputs. Cost of inputs. Cost of inputs. Okay, the main thing that's driving the supply curve is what does it cost me to get the things that I have to produce this? What's the cost of the labor? What's the cost of the land? What's the cost of rent? What's the cost of the physical things or even non-physical things, right? We live in a service-oriented, technology bait, right? All these things that have less physical components than we might think in a lot of like classic examples, right? If the cost of inputs goes up, you are willing to supply less of it. It's a pretty straightforward thing, right? If it costs more, the profitability is less, you're willing to do less of it. Now, here's the real kicker, and one of the most confusing things in any principles class. This means supply moves to the left, right? Now you would think, okay, it's a decrease. That means it's going to move up, down, right? Decrease means down. Increase would mean up. It doesn't, and the reason for that is economists early on when they worked on these models, they they started with the theory, right, that the relationship wasn't that price drove quantity, but that quantity drove price. And so they wrote the model this way. Remember, this is the x-axis and this is the y-axis, so that's your dependent and independent variable. Economists got that backwards with their first theory, and then once the notation was set, it became hard to undo, right? So it's sort of like negative and positive poles in a battery. As a consequence, right, supply decreasing is actually working to the left, but we can see why that is. At this price level, the higher supply leads to a higher quantity, And the lower supply curve, because S2 is the lower supply curve, leads to a lower quantity. Okay, so try to remember that. I know that's a bit of a stumbling block. That's a thing that'll be tested on quizzes and exams, so do try to keep that in mind. Okay, our second determinant of supply is probably the hardest, and what we mean is by commodities, the price of commodities is alternative things that could be used to produce something. Okay, so when I say input, what do I mean? I mean that's the thing that we're using to produce things, right? So if I am producing furniture, right, and I'm using wood to produce my furniture, the cost of inputs means the wood. But I could be using other things, those other things that I could be using to produce it in their basic form, which is why we call them commodities, right? Those also have a relationship. Those also have a relationship to how it is that my cost structure would look like in the firm, right? Okay, so I'm producing furniture. I could be using lumber, producing wooden furniture, or I could be using these new plastics, or I could be using wicker, or I could be using metal, right? Any number of things, and the price of those things factor in. Now, it's not immediately easy to see why, but part of the reason why is that markets are dynamic. Markets are a process, right? Part of what it is that producers are doing is they're trying to decide on a production process. They're choosing among alternatives, okay? So one of the reasons that government intervention, and especially like in its extreme form, like central planned economies, i.e. communism, the reason that they don't work, the reason that that fails in an economy, and we should always, as a default, be looking to not see intervention in the market, is because markets don't take a given production process, produce things, and then make them available for people to purchase. They determine how it is that we produce things. Remember way back, the very first thing that I said in this class, right, is economy's job is to determine what we produce, how we produce, and who gets it. Markets are what do that, and they do that dynamically. They choose among alternatives that how it is that we are producing things, what we are using to produce things. And those alternatives means those things are not discovered at the time, and those things are subject to change if situations around them change. Okay, this is what economists really, it's not even economists, use this idea, but this isn't unique to economics. This is the idea of discovery versus learning. Discovery versus learning, right? Learning means there's something out there that I don't know, but I know that I don't know it, and I learn it, right? So I take up a new sport. I take up golf. That's something that I've picked up in the last few years, and so I say, man, I don't know the rules of golf, but I know I don't know them, and so then I learn the rules of golf. Okay. But unbeknownst to me, right, in my golf swing, there are biomechanics involved that I don't even know are a problem, right? How do I grip the club? How do I stand? How do I address the ball? And so part of learning golf, part of my process in golf is learning, right? Because I know I don't know. Part of it is to discover. Discover means finding things, understanding things, studying things that I didn't know, right? And that's what it is that markets do, right? Learning actually can sort of be replicated. It's still imperfect and bad because your incentives are misaligned, and there's lots of problems. We'll cover that later on in this class, that central planning actually can kind of do, right? It can say, oh, what are skills that we need? Let's find those skills. Let's get scientific information into the hands of the workers, right? That actually can kind of be done. It's still a poor substitute for markets, but it can be done. What it can't do is discovery. What it can't do is say, we don't know what we don't know, and so we're going to go out there and find it. That's what markets can do, and that's why markets are so important. Okay, so how does this play out in this particular situation? Well, if the price of alternative ways of doing business rises, that lowers our viability in what it is that we are currently doing. We have fewer options. Our supply will end up going down. Okay, another obvious one is technology of production, right? So if we have better technology, more efficient technology, Supply goes up. What does supply going up look like? It's, remember we said leftward for down. It's just rightward for up. How do we see that? At a given price, how much are we willing to supply? Well, it's this lower quantity, and then if supply goes up, it becomes the higher quantity, just to highlight what it is determinant of supply looks like. Okay, again, you guys have this by now. You, the viewer here, you got the pattern, right? Same way, number of buyers, there's number of sellers, right? If we have more sellers in the market, obviously that means they're supplying more. Now, maybe a more interesting one is taxes and subsidies, right? So if you tax something and you apply the tax to the supply of that thing will go down. A good example of this is like cigarettes. We have what's called sin taxes, right? And so we tax things that we think, oh, these are bad for people's health and it's a bad behavior and other people don't like to be around people who are smoking cigarettes. And so we put a tax on cigarettes and so the supply of cigarettes goes down, right? Turns out we're also taxing labor. That's called the income tax, right? And if you tax something, you get less of it. So economists generally don't like income taxes because we're actually taxing work, labor, productivity. It means you're going to get less of it. Those are bad things, okay? A subsidy is just kind of the opposite of a tax, right? It's something that we're giving money to instead of taking money from for a particular behavior. If you don't subsidize something, you get more of it. Lots and lots of examples of that, obviously, in economics, and those will come up later when we get to like fiscal policy and whatnot. Okay, in the same way that expectation of future price matters for demand, it also matters for supply. What happens now if we think the price will go up in the future? Well, I'm going to pull some of my supplies off the shelves. I'm going to save them for later when the price will end up being higher. Okay, now I want to hit us with a quick example that we've actually talked about a little bit here. The price of cowboy boots goes up. What happens to the supply of cowboy boots? Think to yourself. Write your answer down. Does supply shift? The supply of cowboy boots does not change. No change. Remember, this is the price and quantity relationship. That's a movement along the curve. So the amount supplied will change, but the supply curve itself doesn't change. Okay? Trick question. You're going to get this exact question. Probably I'll swap out cowboy boots for something else. Maybe I won't. You're going to get this exact question. I'm going to say, what happens to the supply of cowboy boots if the price of cowboy boots changes? So the quantity, the amount supplied, right back to this relationship here, this will happen, but you won't see a shift in it. Okay, now let's combine these ideas. What happens when we have a demand curve, nice, beautiful, downward sloping demand curve, and we have a supply curve. Nice, beautiful, upward sloping supply curve. Okay, what happens here? Let's pick some good here so that we can talk about it, right? iPhones, always a fun example. Okay, iPhones, we could put phones, mobile phones, smartphones, whatever you want in there, right? And so the people that are out there, they're selling iPhones, and the initial price that they try is $100. $100. Well, I'm doing this, but obviously it takes us a while to sort of get used to it and to see it and everything, right? If you set the price at $100, how much will people want? The answer is a lot. So the quantity demanded in this initial situation is very high, right? I mean, this is intuitive. Just like I said before, the price of something is lower. People want more of it. You kind of intuitively know what the price of an iPhone, brand new iPhone is, right? Latest gen, fresh out the box, all those nice things. How much, though, is Apple going to want to provide? The answer is very little. So what's happened here? Now there's this really big gap between the amount that we want and the amount that ends up supplied. So the demand is much greater than the quantity that's being supplied. The quantity demanded much greater than the quantity supplied. We got this big shortage, right? So what happens? It's emergent, right? It's emergent. So the price conveys to the consumers, hey, look, this is like not costly to produce, and other consumers don't have this super high value for it, and so at this price you can consume a bunch of it, right? In the same time, it's what's it conveying to the suppliers, saying, listen, it's not that high valuation to people, and so you're not going to be able to sell much of it. That turned out to be wrong in this case, right? Because the demand curve actually is way over here. So very quickly, and you can imagine exactly how this works, very quickly, suppliers realize I can produce more of these things and charge a higher price, which is like the best situation to be in. So they raise the price dramatically, right? And come to find out, still, this price is too low, because even though we're willing to produce and supply a bunch more at this price, people still want even more. They're just flying off the shelves. What happens? Well, keep raising the price at somewhere around 1,000. I don't know the exact price. Somewhere around 1,000, we get this magical quantity, this equilibrium quantity. And at this point, quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. So what I showed you is when the price is too low, there's upward pressure on the price because the demand greater than supply, right? And so we'll see this pressure to move the price upward, which is going to move the demand quantity back down the demand curve. It looks like up, right? But you know what I mean by down. And it pushes the amount that wants to be supplied. When these things are equal, when the amount supplied and demanded is equal, what's true? There's no force. Think like physics, right? These are forces. There's this demand force. There's this supply force. When they're balanced out, what is price going to do? Nothing, because they're in balance. And that's what we mean by equilibrium. Okay, let's do the same example the other direction so that we have this nice and clean in our minds, right? What happens if the price initially gets set too high? Well, now the amount that we want to produce and sell is really high, but the amount that people want to buy is really low, right? And so what happens? Well, of course, know what happens, right? You go to the store, you see, oh man, they produced way too many of this, not very attractive looking shirt, so now it's on sale. They lowered the price, right? And so through trial and error, right? And this is an important thing. We live in this age now where it seems like we can just learn everything through science, and then we forget that almost everything we know, including science, by the way, is learned by humans through trial and error, right? It's things that we tried, we made some notes, we learned some lessons, people thought about it, studied it, which is science, by the way, or just practical experience, and began to learn things, right? Markets are a way that happens emergently, right? Price gets driven down here, and now the gap between quantity supplied and quantity demanded is lower, but it's still a gap here. We still have this surplus. Until we get to this equilibrium price where the two are in balance. Okay, I'm going to leave that because that should be somewhat clear to you. We see this downward pressure on prices when we sell too much, because if you produce too much, can't sell it, you're not making the most money that you could be making. You're going to want to lower the price in order to sell more, but because you lowered the price, you're not going to want to sell as much. Those two things work together to kind of put us in balance. Here's an interesting example that I experienced. I had the good fortune before the COVID pandemic hit to have invested in a home gym, right? And so we saw there's this supply of barbells being produced, right? And there's this normal looking demand curve, sort of pre-pandemic, for barbells, right? That's not a very good looking demand curve. Pre-pandemic, okay? So there's this demand, and so it sets the price. There's some price. There's some price out there for barbells, and created this quantity, right? And then what happened? Pandemic comes along, and barbells are a really good substitute for what? For a gym membership. Why? Because you can essentially rent access to a barbell instead of own one, right? So this is the market for barbells here. Should make that clear. There's not a market for COVID. Market for barbells, right? Along comes the pandemic. What happens? The demand for barbells goes up really, really sharply, right? Okay, so this is our pandemic demand, right? Because one of our substitutes, and this is a lesson actually that's very important. What was the price of going to a gym when all of them got shut down during the COVID pandemic? And you're thinking zero. That's wrong, right? Because zero means you can get a quantity of it, as much as you want of it, quantity of it, without paying anything. But during the pandemic, how much gym access did you have? The answer is none. Not as much as you want, not some amount for nothing. The answer is the price was infinity. Doesn't matter how much money you had, or probably close to infinity. Really, 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 really high, because no matter how much money you had, you couldn't get into a gym, right? You couldn't get into a gym. And so what happened? The price of a substitute got really, really high, to the point of being infinity for most of us, normal people that, who knows what the extremely wealthy did during the pandemic. But for the majority of users, no access at all. And demand actually went up. Demand went up for barbells because that's a substitute, because the price of gyms went really high. And so the amount that people were willing to pay in equilibrium went up. Now, what's really interesting about this? Right? Price went up, quantity went up. What does that mean? I was working out, minding my own business in my garage door open. Some people walk by, walking their dog, getting their exercise. They're fit people, look like they're the kind of people that could use a barbell. They come up to me and they say, "Hey, is any of this for sale?" I'm just minding my own business, lifting weights, right? And of course I said, yeah, I suppose for a price. Now, if I have a barbell and I sell a barbell, then I don't have a barbell, right? And so what's happening here? There's a market developed. There's prices emerging, right? Now, I'm a competitive powerlifter. I really enjoy lifting. It's a really important part of my life. So I put a really high value on a barbell, right? If I sell my barbell, I don't have one, then I can't work out. But there's some number out there that'll be willing to sell my barbell. What if they said, listen, money's no object, but we can't find a barbell anywhere. We'll pay off your mortgage on your house. Barbell's gone, right? Deal, no problem. Now, are they willing to do that? No, obviously not. I had a discussion with the people. I said, I would sell you a barbell, right? Because there's some number out there, but it's really high. Because I don't know how long this pandemic's going to last. Lifting's really important to me. If I do without this, then all the problems you have not being able to work out, now I have, right? So we ended up not being able to come to an agreement there. But the price that they were willing to pay was different than the price they were willing to pay before the pandemic, right? Because their valuation of the barbell changed. But what else changed? Right? The cost of producing the barbells got weirdly high as well, right? Now, and there's a lot here. Markets, we draw these markets on this graph and we say, oh, look, like here's this price, and it just emerges. But why is it that I can say this quantity went up, right? Rogue, Elite FTS, Kabuki, all these places that make bars, they didn't really produce that many more bars. But how is it that the supply quantity went up? Well, individuals like me were in the market potentially or actually providing barbells, because, what if I had two barbells, right? What if you came up and said, oh, look, you got two barbells on the wall, I'll take that second barbell off your hands, right? I might be able to sell a used, not as good quality bar for like a price that would normally have bought me a brand new high quality bar, right? It was very valuable to the people that bought it, right? Remember, value is subjective. In that moment, right? You say, okay, we might have to be locked down for however long, be without a gym for a year. A used decent barbell might be worth the price of a normally new high-end barbell in that moment, right? Because the alternative is what? What's your opportunity cost? Your opportunity cost is not working out at all for a year, potentially, right? And so we see that actually markets, prices, and this idea of emergence is really, really useful for helping us analyze things. Okay, speaking of analyze things, let's look at a fun example. Okay, and I want to remind us that this is mutually beneficial exchange, right? When an exchange happens, both parties are better off. It's important to remember that economic activity is fundamentally good because things that improve both parties when they engage in a transaction, those things are good things, right? If we have something that's zero sum, that's not mutually beneficial, right? I'm going to rob you. Is more activity like that good? No, because I benefit and you suffer, right? That's a bad thing. If I don't rob you, but instead trade with you, I've made you better off and I'm better off. So more of that is good. More economic activity is good. Let's look at a kind of a fun example that we see often during political cycles. Suppose that we're considering the market for ammunition. Right? So there's some normal supply curve. There's some normal demand curve for ammunition, and it leads us to some price. Right? I'm lumping a bunch of things together. Ammunition's really different ammunitions, different uses, different qualities, different types, everything, right? But just broadly speaking, market for ammunition. Okay, two things happen. First, the cost of making ammunition goes up. Okay, so production parts, inputs that producers use to make ammunition goes up, right? Classic example of this would be like the minerals that are used to make lots of the parts of ammunition come from places in the world like Afghanistan and off in the mountains in that region of the country, right? And access to those, it's not constant. It's a very difficult thing. What happens? Well, we've got a model for that. Cost of inputs rises. The amount supplied is going to go down. What does that look like? That looks like this, right? We call it 2 just for clarity's sake. Okay? At the same time, in the United States, the political party that looks like it's winning the election, or is winning wins the election, is the kind of party that seems to be against guns. And so what do people that are buying ammunition think? Wow, the price of ammunition is probably going to go up in the future. Why might that be? Well, we have good examples of this on the supply side, but it also works on the demand side. Maybe taxes, right? Maybe restricted access, maybe regulations. Lots of ways that we would see the price, we would expect the price of ammunition to go up in the future. What's demand going to do in that setting in the current time period? It's going to go up, right? It's going to go up. So demand goes up. So these two things happen simultaneously, right? These two things happen simultaneously. Let's do some analysis, right? Let's do some analysis. What happens to the price? Well, supply looks like it's raising the price. Demand increase. Supply and demand increase both raise the price. What happens to quantity, though? Well, supply going down, that lowers the price, right? So when the supply moves this way, lowers the quantity. We expect quantity to go down, right? What's the problem here? Demand does the opposite effect, right? Here to here, it looks like quantity is going up, right? Quantity is going up because if we demand more, quantity is supplied, quantity demanded, those things should go up. Supply goes down, quantity supplied, quantity demanded, both go down. What happens? Well, the answer is we don't know. We don't know what happens. I'm using this example to really highlight something for us here, right? That when we see supply and demand both moving, it's going to lead us to sort of a quantitative, an empirical question on either price or quantity, because in theory, we don't know which way it's going to go. Let me show you this in a way that's going to make some sense analytically. Okay, so I always write these down in a table and we say what's the effect of supply going down, what's the effect of demand going up, and then what's the total effect. Okay, if supply goes down, what happens? Price goes up, quantity goes down. If demand goes up, what happens? Price goes up, quantity goes up. So here we can see pretty easy the net effect is going to be that the price is going to go up. Supply going down drives price up, demand going up drives price up. The outcome on quantity is unclear. Because supply going down will drive quantity down, demand going up will drive quantity up, so the net effect is unclear. There will be some effect, and here, what's it kind of look like? Looks like maybe I drew the demand changes a little bigger because it's over here, so it probably looks like it's slightly going up. Okay, you're going to get questions like this on the quiz. Be prepared. You're going to be asked what the net effect of like price and quantity is going to be in a two-situation change like this. Okay, there you go. Real-world analysis, right? Real-world analysis. What do we see? It's hard to know what the actual total amount supplied and demanded is going to be, but we know the price is going to go up. Let's take another look at like a classic one, right? A classic one. What happens in a housing market when we put what's called rent controls here? And I'm going to bear with me, you're going to see ceilings and floors more in just a moment, but it's a good example. The supply of housing, the supply of rent is what we call very inelastic. Now, for the purpose of this class, you take microeconomics, you'll learn a lot about this. For the purpose of this class, not a big topic for you to be worried about too much right now. Okay, but basically it means price going up doesn't allow a lot more of it to come to market, right? So it's a little bit insensitive to price, okay? And we're also going to have demand curve. Now, demand's kind of the other way around, actually. It's pretty sensitive to price, right? The amount of people wanting to go and rent their own place and get out of their current living situation, whether they're currently renting with somebody else, whether they're renting house versus apartment, whether they're living with their parents or other family members, all those things are going to be a factor, right? And so at the current situation, there's some rental price and there's some quantity available. There's some quantity available, right? What happens if the government comes along and says, hey, you can only charge a certain price? So this is the price under rent controls. The price under rent control. So this is what we call a price ceiling. I'm going to subscript it because I don't want to be confused with the price of complements. Price ceiling. Well, what happens, very obviously, is if this is the price that can only prevail in the market, lots of people are like, hey, prices are lower. We'd really like, let me call this quantity demanded. We'd really like that. And so they go into the market looking for a house. People begin to search. Remember, what's demand mean? Willing and able. So these are people that are willing and able. And so they're actually in the market. They're actually affecting the price because when you go to sell something, you have more people willing to buy, more people able to buy, and they're going to look for it, right? But what's the problem? There are a few houses, and again, not a lot, right? Because there's only so much that you can. Housing supply is very fixed. It's hard to add. It's hard to subtract housing availability. I guess it's easy to subtract, but it's not practical, right? Because if you own this kind of asset, you want to rent it out to make money on your asset to pay off either the loan you have on it, or even if you don't have a loan on it, you don't want that sitting around doing nothing, right? Now you got this gap between the amount that people want to rent and the amount that people want to supply in order to be rent. We call this a shortage. Classic example. This is probably the quintessential example for ceilings and floors. Let's talk about ceilings and floors. So what's a ceiling? What's a ceiling? Well, you got supply. I'm just going to make supply and demand nice, normal looking curves here. A ceiling says there's only so much you can charge. Now, it's very important, price ceilings, they have to be below equilibrium. Notice that it's below equilibrium, right? Because they're trying to hold price down. What do ceilings do? They hold things down. So imagine I got a little balloon here. It's trying to rise. It's bumping against the ceiling. It can't, right? What's the outcome? Inevitable outcome is that's going to reduce the amount that people want to provide in the market, but it's going to increase the amount that people want to consume in the market, and we're going to get that shortage. Okay. The corollary to that is the floor. Right, so we know the example of rent control for price ceilings. What's like a classic floor is like minimum wage. It's the minimum that you can. There's a minimum that you can pay, and so we're going to hold the wage above the market clearing rate. We got this price floor. What do floors do? They hold things up, right? Keeps you from falling, right? What's the inevitable outcome of that? Well, you're going to want less of it if the price is higher. Remember, that's our straightforward intuition from the very first thing we did. But obviously people at higher prices want to supply more. This is what we get called a surplus. Okay, that's all I have for this lecture. I will leave you guys with that, and see you on the next video.